Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I am here today at Sampo in Riihimäki in Finland. This is the 100th anniversary of the factory's existence, and they have been generous enough to let me in to take a look at some of the really cool historical guns in their factory reference collection. And what we have here is perhaps one of the rarest, and to me, one of the most interesting Finnish light machine guns really kind of ever developed. This is an L-34, which was sort of nicknamed Sampo, developed by Aimo Lahti in, as the name implies, the 1930s. So originally, Lahti had produced the LS-26 light machine gun, which was Finland's standard issue light machine gun going into the Winter War. And it's a complex gun that was not particularly well received in the field. And one of the reasons behind that is that it is a recoil-operated light machine gun. Now, most of the powers in World War II had adopted gas-operated light machine guns. When the Finns developed the LS-26, there was sort of a directive from the military brass that it should be recoil-operated. And the reason being was that they had the Maxim gun, which was a recoil-operated heavy machine gun, and it worked very well. Let's stick with what works and what we know is good. Therefore, we should have a recoil-operated light machine gun. Now, the LS-26 is a complex design. It's not necessarily a bad gun, but it didn't work out well in the field. But turn the clock up from the 1920s to the 1930s, Sweden has adopted the BAR, which is a gas-operated light machine gun, and it's actually working out really well for them. They adopted it first in the early 20s. They would go back in 1937 and update it and continue to use it. And the Finns see the Swedes having very good success with the BAR and decide maybe there is something to this gas-operated light machine gun idea. Hey, Aimo Lahti, why don't you go design one? And so in 1934 at VKT, which was the state rifle factory, he put together this design, which unfortunately this one is missing its magazine and its bipod, but it is one of, I think, only two that still survive. So I'm very happy to get a chance to take a look at it. So it looks, the configuration is very similar to, say, the Bren, the Japanese Nambus. This was a common setup for light machine guns in the 1930s. It's box magazine fed with a top-mounted magazine. This allows you to have an assistant gunner very easily change magazines while the gunner himself can focus on sights and shooting. It allows the gun to be relatively low to the ground because you don't have a magazine sticking out the bottom. This is the reason the BAR was limited to 20-round magazines. Anything longer than that would get in the way of shooting prone, not an issue with a top-mounted gun, top-mounted magazine. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a closer look at this because while it is obviously influenced heavily by the ZB-26 and the Bren, it's got some very substantial differences. All right, we have a couple markings on the receiver here. Serial number is 3 on this particular gun. Its actual designation is L-34, and it was manufactured by VKT, which is the Finnish state rifle factory. And then its sort of nickname, Sampo, is interesting in that there's a lot to unpack in that name. It is named after, it's a difficult thing to translate. Think it comes from the Finnish national epic, and it is a machine that simply gives without requiring input. Think of it as perhaps a cornucopia, maybe in English language tradition. Like I said, it's a hard thing to translate, but it implies that this is a very successful, very efficient. Efficient isn't really quite the word, but a perpetual motion machine is kind of similar in these. Basically, it's a really darn good gun. We have a selector lever here on the left side with positions for semi-auto, full auto, and safe. I'm not going to try and translate the Finnish words behind those abbreviations, but that's what they are. There's a stop at this end, and then this is held in place simply by a spring detent. So it's stiff. I'm going to lift it up a little bit to move it, but it locks quite solidly into these detents in the receiver. This example is in 7.92 Mauser, or 8mm Mauser caliber. Like I said, this was developed potentially both for Finnish service in 762x54, as well as export service. And for export, 792 Mauser was kind of the best single choice to make. And then we also have a disassembly lever here on the side, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, a couple neat features of the design. We have a receiver that's very Bren-like. Notice that the magazine well is a separate component, and there's one pin here that holds the magazine well and the magazine catch in place. So in order to produce this in different calibers, say for commercial production, it would be very simple, as long as they all fit in the same overall receiver length, to simply make an interchangeable magazine well. The rear sight has not been marked with range graduations because, this is one of the very first run, the only run, of basically prototype guns. But you can see that we have a notch sight here offset to the left because, of course, the magazine is in the center. Since the magazine's already in the center, you can lock your carry handle in position. That also acts as a barrel handle for changing hot barrels, which we'll get to in just a moment. And then we have a front sight that is also, of course, offset to the left. Small conical flash hider, and the gas block is actually built into the barrel itself. The gas port is way out at the end of the barrel, very much like a ZB-26. Had this been developed further, I think there's probably a decent chance it would have moved backwards as the Bren did. The bipod would have been mounted right here. Unfortunately, it's missing on this example. And then, unlike the Bren, but similar to, for example, the Châtellerault 2429, this ejects out the side of the receiver. So the bottom is solid, and we've got a nice big solid charging handle here that allows you to retract the bolt. Notice when this goes into battery, the bolt doesn't lift. This is not a tilting bolt, but it's close. So for disassembly, I'm going to start by locking the bolt back. The charging handle is non-reciprocating, and it's also not spring-loaded, so we'll pull it back into position there. Then I just have this one big spring detent or spring lever on the top. Push that in, and I can rotate the barrel. This has interrupted threads on it. And just pulls right off like that. Now you can see the gas block assembly out here on the end, complete with a bit of old gunk in it. And the gas port itself can be adjusted here. It's not quick adjust, and this is very likely something for developmental work, sizing the gas port just right. So this, you pull this cotter pin and you can thread this in or out to change the gas pressure in the gun. Now, to field strip the rest, we're first going to let the bolt forward gently, and then we have a disassembly lever back here. This has the same sort of spring detent. So all I have to do is lift that up 90 degrees and it unlocks. Can just pull it out of the gun, and then the buttstock comes off. This is just held in place by that one locking pin. See the little locking flange right there. This has the recoil spring, and it also has a spring-loaded buffer right here, just to cushion final impact of the bolt carrier. Neat to point out that this has a very Finnish Mauser style sling slot in it. This is also a buttstock that is somewhat reminiscent of the 0815 Maxim, which would make sense. Finland had 0815 Maxims that it acquired after World War I. Next up, with the buttstock removed, we can pull out the very long gas piston / operating rod and the bolt. Isn't that cool? We'll touch on that in just a moment. And then lastly, the trigger assembly comes off the bottom of the gun. So pop that back. This runs on 2 rails right here. Again, similar to the Bren. And we have a fairly long trough that just covers up the bottom of the receiver, and then our fire control group here. This is a simple sear system. So this locks into a catch on the bottom of the bolt carrier right there. In full auto, this stays down. In semi-auto, this is high enough that when it pushes back, it will reset the sear. And then in safe, I can't move the trigger at all. The bolt and carrier here are both really quite nicely marked. 3A, I assume, indicates that there were multiple sets of parts. And this is caliber 792. Now this just lifts straight off the carrier. So what we have here is a hook in the carrier that is going to hold on to the firing pin right there, so that when this bolt closes here, it pushes the firing pin forward automatically and fires the gun. That is to say, this fires from an open bolt. The locking system uses this lug to control a pivoting block. So this locks in a similar way to guns like the Bren with a tilting bolt. However, the bolt itself does not move. You don't have to worry about a change in angle of the bolt face. Instead, you just have a locking block at the back that runs in this track. So when the system is locked, that lifts up, locks into a recess in the top of the receiver. And by the way, that right there, so this sits actually right like that. This is your locking shoulder. It's a separate piece so that it can be independently hardened and it can be changed if necessary. And then when the bolt carrier starts to recoil after firing, it's going to push this lug back, which pivots the locking lug down. You can see there's just a simple round curve, round recess there, and a round lug here, and they interact to do that. Overall, by the way, the L-34 here has 58 parts and weighs in at 8 kilos, compared to the LS-26, which weighs 9.3 kilos, so close to 3 pounds heavier, and has 118 parts, so more than twice as many parts as this. This was a much nicer design. I also want to point out, when this is fully in battery, when you fire, the bolt carrier is going to start moving backwards. There is a significant amount of travel right until there before the locking lug actually unlocks. So there's a centimeter, something between 3/8 and half an inch of travel. And that gives the system a lot of time for the bullet. I mean, the bullet's just about left the barrel by the time this starts moving because of how far forward the gas block is. This gives a lot of time for pressure to drop and ease extraction before the system has to actually open up. And last but not least, we have a significant cut on this side of the bolt. This is upside down, so the bolt would be like this in the gun. This is for the ejector. So looking at this as if you're at the front of the gun, this lug is going to feed a cartridge out of the magazine. This is your extractor, and then the ejector pin is fixed in the gun right there. You can see it from the top, and it's installed right here on the left side of the receiver. So that is going to slide in this groove, and when the bolt comes all the way back, it's going to kick the cartridge out that ejection port in the right. So there is the L-34 Sampo, all field stripped. I should point out the Finnish military actually did fairly significant field trials on this design, but not until the 1950s, well after World War II. And it actually performed very well in those trials. However, by the time that was being done, sort of the Finnish tactical requirements, the mission for the light machine gun had changed, and they were looking more at something that was going to be belt-fed. And the L-34 just didn't fit the role, regardless of its quality as it was put together. So it's a gun that had a tremendous amount of potential that just was never quite realized. Only a handful of these were manufactured, probably about 10 of them. They didn't actually see service. They were just kind of at exactly the wrong time. By the time this would have been ready for commercial production, which VKT was certainly interested in doing, most of the other major military nations in the world had already adopted a new gun. The British already had the Bren gun. The US, of course, was sticking with the BAR. The Russians had the Ejector. The ZB-26 was an excellent gun that was already out in the market and had found a lot of customers that potentially would have been people that Finland could sell the L-34 to, except, well, they already have ZB-26s or ZB-30s. At the same time, it fell victim in Finnish service to basically bureaucracy and politics and wasn't put into production. Lahti would continue to develop this design. He had a follow-up design in the early 1940s that we'll touch on in a later video if I'm able to find an example of one of those. But in total, only like 10 of these were manufactured, most of them in 7.62 by 39, or 7.62 by 54, or by 53 as it was called in Finnish service. This one and the other surviving one that I'm aware of are both in 8mm, as you saw, and that was development for a potential commercial market. But this certainly had the potential to be a far better gun than the LS-26, and it's a really interesting historical what-if to think about. What if the Finns had been manufacturing these early on? If they'd started production in 34 or 35, they could have had substantial numbers of these instead of the LS-26. And it would have been a significantly superior gun. Would they have adopted basically the Russian Ejector, the DP-27, in as substantial numbers if they had been equipped with this to begin with? Probably not. Probably would have been a good second line gun, but anyway, an interesting historical question. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This is a fantastic gun to get a chance to take a look at, and I'd like to give again a big thanks to Sampo at their 100th anniversary for giving us a chance to take a look at it. Thanks for watching.